Hello, welcome to this week's webcast with Helga. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger. Today is January 25th, 2023, and this could turn out to be an extremely important day with the events that have occurred so far, with the announcement today by German Chancellor Scholz that Germany has submitted to what they call external massive pressure and agreed to send the Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Helga, this is obviously an example of the kind of pressure that's been placed on Germany. And why do you think Scholz went along with this?
Well, I mean, he obviously doesn't have backbone enough to stand up against it. I mean, it flies in the face of what he himself said many times. Remember that in February last year, he said no heavy weapons to Ukraine because this increases the danger of World War III. Now, in the meantime, we have gone a long way, and many weapons have been sent: howitzers, Marder tanks, and now the Leopard 2, which is a heavy tank. And that clearly is a red line for Russia. And it's an attack tank. It's clearly meant to quote reconquer uh, Crimea, the Donbass, who knows, even attacks on Russian territory. So it's a clear escalation in the war between NATO and Russia, and it clearly brings the world one gigantic step closer to World War III. I find it absolutely disgusting. It just underlines the total irresponsibility of the present government. The Greens are obviously the war party par excellence, headed by people who obviously don't have the historical knowledge nor strategic depth to understand what they are doing, but they are driving Germany towards the catastrophe. And I can only hope that the voters will wake up and at the next election vote these Greens out of office, because they are the nail in the coffin of Germany. And I find this absolutely disgusting, because it is U.S. pressure, British pressure, NATO pressure, but it's also pressure from within the coalition, and from the opposition, the CDU, CSU. um, and when you listen to the media in Germany these days, you really think these people have gone completely collectively insane. They're not discussing the consequences of it. They're not discussing that this definitely has the potential of ending up in a global thermonuclear war. And they're just almost euphoric in escalation. And now people in the media are reporting, fantastic, this is finally done. It is sickening.
Well, you mentioned some of the external pressure. I think it's important that Boris Johnson just went to Kiev again. The British, through the Royal United Services Institute and others, have been talking about needing the tanks to go into Crimea. But this is definitely an escalation being pushed from the outside, but the German government is capitulating to it.
Well, I think that there is this whole charade, where Scholz said, "Oh, this, we only act in common with the allies, and the U.S. has to put the Abrams tanks into Ukraine, and as long as they are not doing that, we are not going to put the Leopard 2." Then supposedly, the United States agreed to put some 30 to 50 Abrams tanks into Ukraine. But that will take a long time, probably into late summer, into the end of the year. And it's a charade. This is the Anglo-American empire policy, and I can only say this is absolutely irresponsible against the voters of Germany, against the people of Germany, and it's fundamentally against the interest of the German nation.
Well, Helga, just about a year ago, you put out a statement in response to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists saying we're 100 seconds before midnight. Now they've come out and lowered that by 10 seconds, 90 seconds to midnight. So there are people around the world who are recognizing this danger.
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, we are in contact with many of those in many parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. And I have found that many people we have been talking to in the so-called global south are much more aware of the potential consequences of what this can have than the people who are sitting there, who would be dead the first ones. And it really reminds me of, there is this story that there was this waterfall, a huge waterfall, and then they interviewed the people who are very, very far away, and they say, yeah, yeah, there's this waterfall, and if the dam breaks, eventually the water will come here, but it will be so low, won't do much harm. Then they interview the people who are sort of a little bit closer but still in a certain distance, and they say, oh, this is so dangerous. If this dam breaks, we all will be totally wiped out and drown and whatnot. And then they ask the people who are living immediately on the bottom of the waterfall, and they say, what are you doing? Are you not worried that this dam may break? And then the people look right and left and they say, what waterfall? And I think this is almost like the psychological, um, I mean, that obviously does not apply for everybody. There are people who are generally afraid and freaked out, but the vast majority who go along with the so-called rules-based order, which makes all of this necessary, I think they are really showing an incredible degree of, denial of reality. And I think, they will wake up very shortly, because if you look at what the various Russian spokesmen have said, even before the Leopard 2 decision was made, Luciano, I think he's of the Valdai Club, he said, this just means that, Russia will have to attack supply routes, warehouses. Then Ambassador Antonov, who is ambassador in Washington, he said, well, this just means these tanks will have the same fate like all the weapons before. They will be destroyed by Russia. And, so I think people will wake up very, very quickly, because this Leopard 2, while it may be a powerful tank, it's for sure no Wunderwaffen, which will be a game changer, as they say, because, in 2016, this tank was used in Syria, and 10 of them were destroyed relatively easily near Aleppo, which was at that time Al-Bab city occupied by ISIS. So, I mean, it's obviously a clear escalation, but given the fact that many people are not so optimistic about the situation on the ground in Ukraine, as a matter of fact, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who normally has a judgment which is very solid, he said that everybody knows in Washington that Ukraine is a lost cause, that the mood has shifted, that the only reason why they're pushing Germany to deliver these Leopard 2 is because they want to increase the suffering of the Germans, and naturally the Ukrainians. But I think this, and for example, if you read some of the international media, you find similar judgments. For example, Asia Time. I mean, as far as I can see, they have no immediate interest in the situation. They also say that not everything is well in Ukraine, and this is a lost war for the Ukrainians. So it's just absolutely disgusting, because the net effect will be more people will die, more soldiers on both sides, more civilians on both sides, and what we have been saying for quite some time now is this must stop, and you must have negotiations, you must have diplomacy. If you have diplomacy in a couple of months from now, how many more people will have died? If you don't have diplomacy at all, you have World War III. So it's better to have diplomacy now.
And I think what's coming out clearly from some of the American military analysts is that there's panic in Ukraine. The Zelensky is shaking up his government. The hope that they have is that these tanks will come in and be a game changer. But I think the point that was made by some of the comments that you just quoted is that the Russians are prepared for this. Now, in the meantime, what we're seeing is a self-destruction in Germany, including in the economy, but this lack of reality, the sense that I think Baerbock said today, this is a war between, we're in a war now. And I think that's quite dangerous, isn't it?
It's a tragedy, you know. I mean, what is happening with Germany right now is really absolutely tragic. I mean, first of all, you know, what all of these developments underline to anybody, both inside Germany, if they want to see it, but it's the talk of the town around the world that Germany is an occupied country, that we have no sovereignty. And, you know, I think that has to be changed because, you know, if you have a country which is in such a condition, you know, it leads to cultural pessimism. And I think the history shows that cultural pessimism can turn into very, very bad things. And we had this in Germany more than 80 years ago. And, you know, I think that the condition of the German people right now is you have the ones on the one side, you have the flight forward, insane, you know, oligarchy and their hangers on to power who are bubbling about a rules-based order when they're violating every possible rule. And then you have the majority of the people who are more and more depressed. It's very dangerous.
Well, you also have the case where there was a peace activist who was just sentenced to a fine and time in prison for trying to raise the question of why Russia launched the special military operation.
Yes, this was the 81st anniversary of the German attack on Russia. And he made a speech, which I read parts of it, and I talked to somebody who actually was participating in that event. And according to this eyewitness, this was a very calm speech where all this person did was to say, you know, that given its history, Germany should never again participate in an attack on Russia. And then he elaborated that. I have not found anything which is so upsetting in this speech, but the lower court in Berlin basically fined him either 2,000 euro or 40 days in prison. He's appealing now that judgment. But if you cannot, you know, if you cannot start to discuss the history, what led to this situation, I mean, what is this? Is this democracy? Is this a scientific discussion about, you know, historic processes? I mean, this is so absolutely blatant that I think, you know, we are really looking at an effort by the EU with their guidelines, you know, to pre-bunk any story which could be construed as being a Russian uh, fake news. But you know, if you cannot anymore discuss what is going into a historic event and weigh the backs and forths, and I think in this case it's very, very obvious that this is related to the NATO policy following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we have, you know, published this many times. So if you cannot discuss that, that doesn't mean that you have to say this is. I mean, obviously, war is a tragedy, and it should not never have happened. But if you can't investigate, you know, how it got to that, you can't come up with a solution, because the solution has to be just, and you know, it has to take into account the interest of everybody. And if you can't analyze how it got there, then you cannot come up with a just solution. So I really condemn this court because it's in a very evil tradition.
Well, we also see there was the meeting at Ramstein Air Base where the pressure was put on Germany, but we also see NATO very much in a flight forward. But there are some problems there, especially between Sweden and Turkey. It looks as though the Swedish membership in NATO is being put on hold. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't want to speculate, but there are some people in Sweden who think that, you know, that this was a move by people who absolutely oppose that Sweden becomes part of NATO. by doing these things, burning or hanging Erdogan in effigy upside down, and then burning the Quran, because this has now led to such a clash between Sweden and Turkey, that Turkey will absolutely veto the membership of Sweden. And interestingly, the deputy head of the Patriotic Party in Turkey says that the rift between Turkey and NATO is such that he predicts that Turkey will leave NATO within the next 5 months. So this creates quite some, trouble, and maybe Finland now has to be alone. There's a discussion about that Finland may have to join NATO alone, but NATO is for sure not an alliance which necessarily has to be there forever, given the fact that it lost its raison d'être already with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. There are many people in many countries who think that NATO is obsolete, and are for leaving NATO. And I think the more they are pushing these kinds of coercive measures, the more people probably will come to that conclusion.
At the same time, that's a sentiment that's growing. The global NATO push seems to be accelerating. We just got news today that the new Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States, Kevin McCarthy, is planning a trip to Taiwan, which is being scripted by the Pentagon. What is this? What's the message of this to the Chinese?
Well, I think the Chinese are very interested in harmonious development, and they don't like any kind of conflict. So they have been very hesitant, despite their strategic and military alliance with Russia, they have been trying to be a moderating influence. But I think people should not fool themselves. I mean, the Chinese are looking at what NATO is doing in respect to Russia, and then they see the provocations in respect to Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi, and now the new guy, Kevin McCarthy. And they already answered to that, saying that their response to such a trip by McCarthy will be a much bigger shock than that to the one of Pelosi. And they are following the situation. They also are clearly aware of the fact that the CSIS think tank just recently had a war game in which they looked at a prolonged war between the United States and China, and they came to the conclusion that the U.S. ammunition is only lasting for 1 week. Now, one should note that people don't know economy well. You had the finance minister of Canada, who is a admirer of Stepan Bandera, but she said that you can't control climate, you can't control inflation, but the war over Ukraine with Russia will be the biggest boost in the economy. So the world economy will go fantastic as a result of this war production. Now, that may be true for a short period of time for the military industrial complex CEOs. They are probably filling their pockets like never before. But from the standpoint of the real economy, everything which is being produced for a war economy is a complete destruction of physical goods. It may be profitable for the upper crust of the military industrial complex, but it is undermining the economy. And I totally disagree with this assessment that it will be good for the world economy. It will be, in the medium term, devastating for the Western economies.
Yes, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Freeland, who you're talking about, also said that the U.S. middle class needs a wage cut, which fits in with the discussion going on within the British Parliament, the Sunak government, which is going for austerity. And of course, your husband always pointed out that austerity never solved any problem. And in fact, we see the connection now very clearly between the war hawks, the so called neocons, and the neoliberal economic policy. Now, you've addressed that with your call for a new strategic and development architecture. And we have a conference coming up on February 4th to discuss that on the question of uh, the age of reason or annihilation of humanity. Uh, how can people participate in that, and how do you see this evolving into a mass movement?
Well, I think that the conference topics will be extremely hot, given the fact that you have this escalation with the Leopard 2. You have the efforts to increase the global NATO, the EU NATO agreement, the Japan British agreement, the so-called reciprocal cooperation agreement, the AUKUS between Australia, the US, and Great Britain. So you have a whole clear sign that global NATO is preparing for the showdown with Russia and China, and more people, especially in the global south, are waking up to this. On the other side, you have the clear efforts, to establish a different world economic system, and that is progressing very quickly as well. You know, Foreign Minister Lavrov was just in South Africa, and South Africa will host the BRICS summit this coming year. So a lot is really going on, and we will discuss these things in a way which most people do not really have access to, because the mass media, I mean, unless you already know what you are looking for and you search the internet and you go to the newspapers in media of different countries and you look at it from different angles, which most people neither have the time nor that they really know what to look for, because you have to be acquainted with the history of many countries, and very few people have that knowledge. So we provide an overview because we have live actors, former presidents, former ministers, diplomats, other people who represent real life, like representatives of the clergy, the industry, the trade unions. So people have started to appreciate our Schiller conferences very much from the standpoint of really getting an idea where we stand and building an alternative, because we want to build more and more people who agree that we have to discuss what should be the principles of the new order, a new paradigm which allows the surviving of the human species, because that's what the most important discussion is. So if you want to, be part of it, then join it, register. Then you get even live translation if you are a non-English speaker in French, German, Spanish. Uh, these are the minimal amount of languages. So and we want to build a movement of world citizens, of people who take the cause of humanity first, and that is an idea where the receptivity is definitely growing.
And one of your initiatives was to send a letter in support of the Vatican's call for negotiations. And this seems to be so obvious that there should be negotiations. Uh, Depending on what happens with the tanks, it looks like these tanks won't be available in the short term. Do you see the possibility that there could be a breakthrough if the population demands it, if there's enough motion to support these initiatives for negotiations?
Yes, because this open letter to the Pope, it's really not directed to the Pope, because the Pope already did make the offer to give the venue of the Vatican as the place for negotiations. So I don't have to convince the Pope, but the people who are undersigning the letter, and that number is growing, especially also the VIPs, so-called, because many people say, you need somebody above the parties to be the sponsor of such negotiations. The letter is more aimed to the population to show them that there is a way how we could end this, by having negotiations without preconditions, and have the Pope mediate. And in the meantime, there are other people, like Lula has been asked by many developing countries to also mediate. Erdogan has offered to mediate. So I think the more countries and the more institutions and the more people support the Pope and give him backing in this idea that this must end, the dying must end, the unnecessary suffering must stop, the better. So please sign this letter and help us to distribute it so that more people can sign it.
And to our viewers, you can find this at the schillerinstitute.com. You'll also find the invitation and registration for the February 4th conference. And this is something that don't just sign up for yourself. Get your friends, get people you know, get your family members. Let's provoke the kind of discussion that shows that people are not blindly walking into nuclear Armageddon. Helga, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, there will be a demonstration on February 19th in Washington, D.C. This will be a coalition of different institutions and parties, but they're all united around the idea that we have to stop World War III. And all the participants basically have said, look, we may disagree on, on the economy, on climate, on, all kinds of things. Let's put these differences behind us, because if we don't stop World War III, it's mute and nobody will be there to discuss it. So I think what is coming together in around this Washington demonstration, and there will be a similar one in Great Britain, and we are also in discussion with many groups in Europe, on the continent, that such demonstrations should take place at that same day in as many cities as possible, also outside of the United States and Europe. So if you are listening from some other place, Latin America or Asia or Africa, and you want to participate in such demonstrations, the best thing is to contact us and we will discuss it, how to do it in the most efficient way. Because the best thing which could happen is if, February 19th is a long time away, but if there is a whole international chorus of people who say, we do not want World War III and we demand a diplomatic solution.
And you can share this video with people you know to give them some of the background that they're being denied by the censorship coming from the mainstream media and the neocon warhawk governments. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.